Welcome to another episode of Speciality Sessions with me, your host, Natasha. Today, I'm joined by Premal Desai, the CEO of hubergroup. Welcome to the podcast, Premal.
Thanks, Natasha, and thank you for having me.
For anybody that doesn't know you and doesn't know hubergroup, would you mind giving everyone a short introduction to yourself and to the business?
Sure, happy to, Natasha. Well, my name is Premal, CEO of the Huber Group. Huber Group is a 261-year-old company now of German origin, and Huber Group is well known in the market for printing inks and packaging solutions. However, we are also now expanding into specialty chemicals. Based on that long heritage of ours. It was founded and grew in Germany, out of Munich, and by acquisitions and organic growth, it has grown over the decades and centuries into a global company. We are now present in 28 countries worldwide, and we export to about 100 countries with thousands of customers in the world.
And from what you've just said there, most people that know Huber Group would, like you say, relate the business to packaging and printing inks. But there is a obviously broader chemical story that's over more recent years. How has that evolution kind of become to exist?
I think, Huber Group grew with over the first about 250 years. Huber Group grew with the printing industry and the technology and the automation of the printing industry, like publications, newspapers, catalogs, books, and all these kind of things. And then, of course, what hit was digitalization. And in the course of digitalization now, of course, the printing industry, in the classical form of all these publications, is in a sharp decline ever since, like, say, for the last 20 years, with an increasing decline over the last 5 to 10 years, as we've seen more and more kind of also digital spreads coming in, which is obviously that a number of these companies who grew with the printing industry then pivoted into the packaging solutions business, which also needs inks and colors of all kinds and shapes, especially with the food and FMCG markets bourgeoising in a number of also emerging markets now. And that is, I think, what is the main pivot over the last 20 years or so. And in order to be able to do this packaging inks on a number of what we call substrates, is surfaces, right? It has to be either carton or paper or plastics or metal or whatever it is. You obviously need to dive deeper into the profound, more basic chemistry of it. Like, how is this ink, this color, basically going to stick to a surface, while at the same time adhering to compliance and regulatory requirements, like it should be non-toxic, right? If it's foodstuff, it should be attractive enough. The light breaking index of anything on plastic and on paper should be similar to a brand color the brand owners, which are all the big companies, kind of design and develop and define. So that is where the chemistry and the technology part comes in as a specialty chemicals producer.
And it's interesting, actually, what you said about this change of, moving from newspapers and magazines. I actually had Andrew Warmington on the podcast, who's the editor for Specialty Chemicals magazine. And it was really interesting having that discussion with him from the perception of an editor and how people are consuming information, whether it's online, through mediums like this, through podcasts.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure there are many businesses out there that are doing the same thing, where you're having to supply your information in different formats, not just written or audio or visual. It's all together all at the same time. The application and transference of things like inks onto packaging is an extremely technical process. And by your own admission, you're not a chemicals guy. How would you describe your background and the road that led you here?
Well, I think there was a convolution of different elements which led me to Huber Group. And frankly speaking, now, while I'm not a chemicals guy, I do grew up as a teenager in the German city of Leverkusen, and my father was a chemist, so I have some chemistry in my blood somewhere. But I decided to go down the business and economics side of things and focus more on the business side. What led me to Huber Group is actually the outreach. See, Huber Group, as a chemicals producer by and large, does have something to do with where my expertise of the last, say, 20 years or so comes from, which is in the steel industry. And we are, as a chemicals producer, we are a process industry. That means that we have a lot of interdependencies along the value chain. We do buy raw materials and then we process them value add into something new, which is a substance which other markets or producers and other companies require. And in that sense, the production process between steel and chemicals is, I would call it same, but very different. But it is a process industry, and process industries have certain economics of how to do business at scale, number one, but also at specificity at that second thing. And the balance between scale and specificity is the constant struggle or the constant art of the business. I used to work for pretty long years at ThyssenKrupp, which is a German steel and industrial conglomerate. And prior to that, I was 10 years about with the Boston Consulting Group, having seen a wide number of industries, but ultimately ended up in the industrial space of steel and industrial applications.
And when you and I were preparing for this podcast, you mentioned almost a homecoming, which I thought was a really nice serendipity to it, isn't it? Where the organisation having roots in Gujarat, that's where your family's from. Can you talk about that homecoming element and why it mattered to you so much? Because it's something that you spoke to me about at length.
Yes, and that definitely is a very special connection between Huber Group and me. See, my grandfather basically left India for then what was called Tanganyika, what a good 100 years ago, yeah, around the 1920s. And he settled there basically in the wake of the empire as Great Britain had taken over Tanganyika, as it was then called, from the Germans after World War One. And then my father was born there, and ultimately I was also born there. And so that kind of pedigree out of Africa is one thing. But then my father decided to move to Leverkusen because he was a trained chemist, and he got a job offer in Germany, which was rare in the 70s. So that's when we moved there, and which is where I grew up. But all the time, I've been, of course, kind of very aware of my Indian origins and my Indian roots. And I spent basically a lot of vacations back in the village in Gujarat, which is just about 20 kilometers north of Vapi, where the main factory of Huber Group is now. So in a way, it is a full circle over 100 years. And it kind of illustrates actually how the world has evolved over, say, the last century or so, right? On the one hand, the colonialism, the end of colonialism, one hand. The other hand, the industrial development of Europe, especially post World War II, was tremendous, and especially in Germany. But now that India is coming in stronger and stronger also onto the global markets, I think it just reflects that journey back often of somebody who left for some other place to find his fortune there, and me coming back in a way to India and to basically very close to my hometown of my ancestors.
And I think that Europe-India connection, both from your personal heritage and also from a business point of view, is a really interesting conversation to have. There is a lot of discussion around supply chain resilience, manufacturing footprints, and alternative sourcing models. So how do you see India's role in evolving that part of the conversation?
I think if we have a look what has happened over the last, say, 20, 30 years in global value chains across a number of basic industries, it doesn't only necessitate in chemicals, whether it's automotive, whether it's other industrial appliances and applications. What has happened is that value chains have specialized in their own value steps to where things can be produced best and better. And of course, also more economical for a number of reasons. And I do think that while a lot of attention has been drawn, of course, into a very strong growth in China, and China now being kind of the manufacturing hub of the world, and there is a role for India to play also in a similar fashion, I think, that India becomes a manufacturing source for a variety of rather economic elements, economic criteria for Europe and North America alike, right? Which is, of course, labor costs and productivity are still at the beginning of a journey of an industrial country. Energy prices, while recently struck by crisis out of the Middle East, are by and large fairly okay and very competitive. And especially now also with India going more and more into more of renewable energies, it's getting more and more attractive. And thirdly, of course, there is a high proximity now also with the free trade agreements India has managed to accomplish both with the EU, but as well also with the US, that obviously all these parties are seeing that there is a lot of mutual benefit to be had. If you manufacture in India and export to the Atlantic basin, notwithstanding that there is historical ties, and these are not only because of the British Empire and the English language, for instance, which is a tremendous advantage, but also simply it ranges long back. Whether it was Alexander the Great or other things, there is a certain Indo-Germanic bridge also between Latin and Sanskrit. A lot of the tech industry in the US is very much also kind of affiliated to Indians who have gone there and built up an industry. So I think there are close ties, very close ties between India and especially Europe and the US, I think, which we can build on to have a further base of manufacturing, sourcing, and supply chain resilience. Now, today, so if you have a look at the supply chains, I think resilience and diversity and flexibility and having options is, I think, at least as much worth as simply having the cheapest kind of source.
From your perspective, what would make a Europe-India partnership work well in practice rather than just sounding good?
I think what would, in practice, I think what, and from my experience on both sides, I would say we still have to grow mutual understanding slightly more. I see over the last 20 to 30 years, there was always the hopes on India were higher than the delivery. This has changed somewhat over the last 10 years or so. Now, India is coming stronger and stronger with the strongest growth of all major economic nations worldwide. Europeans are beginning to see more and more potential also in and out of India, but still the familiarity is less so than perhaps with other big markets like China or big sourcing markets like China. This familiarity, I think we need to increase. At the same time, I think it would be too short-sighted to see that it is just a sourcing platform. I think it is a huge domestic market in its right because it's a huge economic development of its own right. At the same time, it will also be a sourcing platform for European markets. And at the same time, I think much closer partnership, which then can reach into technology and innovation on a very sound and robust understanding that mutual IP has to be respected. And I think that is one of the key elements which will come in to make it more beneficial, right? If IP rights and legal and regulatory conditions are basically more and more similar, which I see coming.
And there is a conversation around European technical heritage with the Indian manufacturing strength. And there's also, I suppose the question is, what does the best of both worlds actually look like when it works well, while doing all the things you've discussed, recognizing each other's IP, alignment on regulatory requirements? What do you think about that?
I think one of the most important thing on that is the talent simply and the potential of talent India provides. And say India is churning out millions of educated people and more. India has one of the highest number of universities in the world, and they're building more and more because the population is still growing. The median age in India will be around 27, 28, whereas in broad societies of Europe, it will be way in the mid 40s.
For
So
sure.
simply this delta alone, I think, qualifies that we will see a lot of talent coming out of India, and which we will then also be able to use. There are more and more so-called global competence centers, or GCCs as the Indians call them, which European and American companies locate into India to have kind of a innovation powerhouse built out of India. Nonetheless, I think still the wealth and the depth and the value of innovation, technical heritage and competence out of Europe, especially if you see the chemical industry, is immense, right? It is still huge. And that's how can we transfer that kind of knowledge at the same time use the Indian talent,
Yeah.
and not only for manufacturing, but also for new innovations is, I think, going to be very interesting to watch.
It's really interesting what you're saying about Indian talent, because obviously from a recruiter's perspective, which is mine, and that's how I see the market with people in different geographies, the amount of technical talent that comes out of the region is huge. It's interesting actually, because I'm working with a client at the moment on a 6-month hiring project, filling all of their senior hiring from director and upwards. And everyone is to be based either in China or India. So they're moving their European heads over, both with local talent and expats. So it's
And
happening.
expats.
It's happening. Yeah.
Yeah,
I think there needs to be
it
a
is.
mix of both, right? In whichever
Absolutely.
geographical area your office, your site is, the key is diversity, isn't it? And we talk about it all the time about having a mix.
Absolutely. And I think diversity is something which is really beneficial. However, I always keep to say diversity doesn't work on its own. It has to be well harvested and well managed and also well groomed so that diversity yields something productive by and large, right? It is not simply you just put a diverse bunch of people in a room and automatically something new. It can be, but ideally it is well balanced and well managed. And the second thing I think what you also said is, indeed, I think it's also becoming more and more interesting if you have very experienced European, especially tech and commercial people, also to be kind of, at least for a certain time of 1, 2, or 3 years, maybe also to be willing to engage into India. And because that is the other part of the leverage, is how this whole experience also in manufacturing, in productivity, in factory layouts and other things, but also in technology innovation, can be then also imported into the competence centers in India. And I think all of this does need, however, which is what the free trade agreements provide, is an institutional framework of reliability and trust, right? Because otherwise, people will always kind of be wary where their IP is going and how that's going to be protected, and how that is not going to be easily copied. So I think there's a number of things around that, which, as far as I see, that there's a lot of detailed discussion going on in India as well as in Europe, in institutions and industrial associations, is how to find collaboration models which will work very productively. And that's very, very encouraging to see, right? Because it, for me personally, of course, anyway, because it combines exactly my two halves of my heart, right?
And it's change, and change is always hard to manage. So it's a period that has to play out, and it's be interesting to see what comes next. And you joined Huber, a huge point of change, a major change for the business. What have you walked into the business, and what has that taught you personally about leadership and guiding people through change?
Yeah. That actually the key challenges of change and of changing within a company, of change management and transformation within a company, are not as culturally diverse as it may seem. They are basically always more or less universal. People have a certain anxiety, especially if they are for long years in a company, that whatever the new is it going to be better than the old? And how am I going to adapt to that? And if you don't tackle that with a certain kind mix of, I always call it curiosity, courage, and confidence as a magical triangle, then I think that always kind of is difficult, no matter in which geographic vicinity you are. I walked into Huber and actually was engaged into a restructuring case which was ongoing in Germany, because Huber was in debt with a German banking consortium. And the family, then the old owners of Huber, put it up for sale. And it was a managed process with several interested parties. And by and large, a consortium of an Indian family conglomerate, the Murugappas out of Chennai, and a New York-based private equity capital firm named Avenue Capital, in this case operating out of its Singapore arm, teamed up to buy Huber. And because of its already strong presence in India, and then to have the whole story not only as being a printing inks manufacturer, but also specialty chemicals offering to Europe and America out of India, which is, I think, a very far reaching and very visionary move for an Indian conglomerate to take. However, I think it's a very, 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 very compelling and very, 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 very attractive value proposition.
And when you are in times of transition, the challenges, like you said, the people, how they feel they're going to fit into it. Do they fit into it? What is it going to mean for them? What do you think leaders need to get right first to manage that change? Is it strategy? Is it the people? Is it communication? Is it speed? Something else?
The usual answer
Good
to that
question.
question, Natasha, is always all of the above, right? It is like, the question is, how is it? There is no recipe for this, I think, right?
Yeah.
Like this is, I think, the third or fourth time in my career I'm experiencing a lot of very intensive transformation and change. And there typically is no recipe. However, I think to get the basics right, which I would call is a business is always about performance, right? So to get the basic performance right, which means that the value chain from sales over production to supply has to be kind of intact and well managed. Like that's what I call the fundamental value proposition. Up and beyond that, I think you do have to expand and project a clear confidence into the direction you're taking. And you have to articulate that very well. Like we have always been saying that while we are a printing inks and a packaging solutions company, we want to expand into specialty chemicals. So, and that has to be clearly because it is a value proposition towards customers, but also for our people. What kind of changes does that incur? That there is a new business also growing parallel to the old business, and how we're going to manage all that is to be taken into consideration. But first and foremost, I think to set certain security is clear for people that, like a big number of the people are not affected because we want to grow, right? So that is very clear that by and large, we're not going to touch a huge restructuring story again. We've been through that. Maybe there's some adjustments necessary in one or two areas, and that you have to, I think, call out loud. But at some point, I think you have to make clear that people are safe where they are.
And that's a really nice story to hear. The European chemicals market particularly, it's been a really, really challenging time. So speaking to companies that are saying, actually, we're planning growth is a really nice story to have, and that actually there is growth and development, and it's not just slashing and cutting people and sites and costs and everything else. So it's good to hear. And you've obviously managed multiple transformations throughout your career at different companies in different industries, but you are new to the chemicals space. So has there been a moment at Huber where your new perspective has helped you challenge an assumption or look at the business differently that maybe other people haven't?
Oh, I think there have been a number of things which are more less specific to a chemical industry and more specific to how a well-run business should go, right? It is one of the things I think we didn't only try, we're succeeding to do at Huber is what we call internally a one Huber philosophy. And the one Huber philosophy is that, historically Huber was managed very much by the country entities, by and large on their own. Because once you have the inks, it's kind of a distribution business to a lot of, say, mid-sized customers, which is highly complex in its own supply chain
Mm-hmm.
and needs to be managed well.
Mm.
I think in the chemicals industry, specifically what I could see from the outside and coming from other process industry, was especially that we are very much also dependent on global supply chains. Not only on the delivery side towards the customer and outbound, but also inbound regarding our supplies. Now, how also to diversify that supply range. And of course, like in a setting like the current couple of months, yeah, I mean, currencies are going topsy-turvy, supply and demand are getting out of whack. There are multi-usages of certain chemical ingredients which go into our industry and our industrial production on the one hand, but also cater to a multiplicity of other industries or other applications in the chemical sphere. And all of a sudden we find ourselves that pricing and costing is becoming, so it's not exactly a lottery, but it's becoming a very multi-point negotiation all around it. And if I speak to also other chemical CEOs, whether in Europe or in India, everybody's kind of concerned about this whole game playing out. So I think supply security and how to make a good purchasing strategy is at least as important as your whole commercial and customer strategy, especially in the chemical or other process industries which process raw materials.
Do you think that point that you said there about secure supply chain is the thing that people outside of the sector probably misunderstand more about a resilient chemical business than anything else?
Well, I think the chemical, like a lot of these basic industries, which are everywhere in our daily lives, but we don't see and touch and feel them, right?
Hmm.
It is, whether it's chemicals, it's basic materials, whether it's cement or other kind of adhesives or whatever it is. I think it is not so easy for um, general public to understand where all it is in, and secondly, how the value chain of especially organic chemistry comes in, and why a petrochemical shock in supply demand relations is so affecting the chemical value chain of organic chemistry. People see, of course, the gas prices, the petroleum prices at the gas pump, which is one part of it. Yeah, but the whole thing, like, everything which is plastics, everything which is adhesives, everything which is basically any kind of oil-based organic chemistries, C4, C6, C8 chemistries, all these are basically not as well known, right? And I mean, I'm seeing with a little bit of worry that chemistry as a school subject is also not gaining
Yeah.
in
Popularity.
reputation. Actually, it is kind of decreasing, right? As far
Mm.
as I see modern curricula, especially around in and around Europe, I would say that all the basic things like chemistry, physics, biology should be even more pronounced, like whatever we call the MINT or the STEM cases. But I don't unfortunately see much of that. So I think it is something also maybe we as chemical industry have also been quite happy about, that it is not so profoundly prominent. But now that supply chains are kind of in disarray, we see that how many facets this all has, far reaching into a lot of things, right?
STEM topics, chemistry in particular. Looking at the stats of this podcast, there's a really broad age range of listeners, right from people at university level right through to retirement. For younger people listening, especially those who may not have followed a conventional route into the industry or are thinking about it and haven't quite made it yet, what would you want them to take from your story in particular?
See, I can only say that whenever there is, and again, I group this around what I call the magical triangle of curiosity, courage, and confidence. Confidence typically comes from the capabilities and the skills you learn and you develop. And so that is something, of course, younger people need to dwell on. But then we have a lot of choices in life, right? Even not taking a choice is a choice, right? So
Yeah.
it's always about the choice. And to have this choice on the side of, if there is a chance of being rather complacent or rather curious, always have a bias for the unknown, always have a bias for the curious, always have a bias for what is going to take more courage. Why? Because I think ultimately that simply leads to your own growth in a personal dimension. And everything which is kind of new and challenging has, if you are confident enough and you can base it on a certain set of capabilities, will always make you grow broader, and always be curious enough also to look left and right? We don't have to stick to one sector. I think in the course of AI and as societies will evolve further and also emerging markets will come, I think what I'm seeing more and more is a more generalistic and multi-experienced kind of track record, I think will be more beneficial than just sticking to one kind of, say, chimney function or subject.
And as we come towards the end of the podcast, I'm asking everyone at the end of their episode in season 2 the same question. So you're not getting away with it either. Is what's something that you've changed your mind about over the course of your career?
I think I went from wanting to be right, wanting to be successful, to now actually wanting to be responsible. And that is something which is a journey, of course, right? But during my consulting days, of course, my profound thing was whether I was right or not, whether it was analytics, whether it was convincing the client, whatever it was. Wanting to be successful is a typical industrial mid-career kind of journey. Wanting to be responsible in terms of really taking, that's what leadership is about. You're responsible for yourself, for sure, because you're also always on stage and you're always a role model. People always see what you do and whether what you say is the same as what you do. But wanting to be responsible is a little bit more than that. It is really trying to be as much as possible responsible for the well-being of everybody who's working for you, but also of the business at large and the performance. And I think there has been this kind of an evolution into my inner growth, if you want it that way. And the sooner I think I got to learn that I want to be responsible and not only successful in terms of I really want to engage with the company, the subject matters, dive into the details, go more granular, and really get into it, the more I have learned, at least. Whether I've been more successful is the judgment of others.
What a great way to end the podcast. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Natasha, for having me, and have a great day.